Attorney General Barr is right. The left is deconstructing the Constitution and the presidency. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today, we're going to be talking about Attorney General William Barr. On November 15th, he gave a speech to the Federalist Society about Article 2, the executive branch, and the powers to the president, the vesting of the executive powers in the president under Article 2, and how it's being undermined by the other branches of government, including the judicial branch, which is implementing nationwide injunctions on clearly constitutional exercises of authority, and Congress, which in many cases is usurping executive powers and giving it away to unaccountable administrative state agencies. And I think that Barr here, he's giving I think a clearly conventional view on executive power under Article 2, going all the way back to the Washington administration and the ratification of the Constitution. In the Federalist Papers, the argument is for a unitary executive authority under Article 2, only having one president at a time, basically deciding against, the framers did at the Philadelphia Convention, against having a council of executive power or other types of administration of executive power. They wanted a unitary executive authority. But now apparently saying that Article 2's vesting clause of executive power in the presidents of the United States is basically a clear grant of unitary executive authority under the Constitution, and arguing for such preservation of the separation of powers from encroachment is an impeachable offense. And we get that idea from Richard Painter. He's a former White House ethics lawyer under the Bush administration, Bush 2, quote, another lunatic authoritarian speech as Barr goes from attacking radical secularists at ND Law to 1 month later attacking the resistance at the Federalist Society. Impeach Barr now. Here you have Bill Pascrell. He's also calling for Barr to be impeached. He's a Democratic congressman from New Jersey. Quote, yesterday, A.G. Barr addressed a radical political group and gave one of the most vicious partisan screeds ever uttered by a U.S. cabinet officer. Barr says Trump should have king-like powers. Barr is a liar and a fanatic and should be impeached and stripped of his law licenses. Mimi Rocha, she's a former assistant U.S. attorney. She retweeted the piece. Lawyers call for A.G. Barr's impeachment after Federalist Society's speech. The piece actually quotes her in this tweet saying, quote, this is so outrageously inappropriate for an AG to be saying you are the head of the DOJ for all Americans, not just the ones in the Federalist Society. Please start acting like one. Well, I think he is acting like the Attorney General, and he's actually giving everyone a history lesson about the evolution or the founding and framing of executive power under the Constitution and how it's evolved since the beginning of the United States. And his thought crime here is apparently adopting Alexander Hamilton's position in Federalist number 70 in 1788 of a strong unitary executive. And this is not a controversial view. This is basically legal doctrine for what the Constitution means. This is the original intent of the framers on unitary executive authority under Article 2 of the Constitution. In it, Hamilton argued, quote, energy in the executive is the leading character in the definition of good government. It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. It is not less essential to the steady administration of the laws, to the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice, to the security of liberty against the enterprises and assaults of ambition, of faction, and of anarchy, which is exactly what Barr was saying in his speech. He said, quote, the consensus for a strong independent executive arose from the framers' experience in the Revolution and under the Articles of Confederation. They had seen that the war had almost been lost and was a bumbling enterprise because of a lack of strong executive leadership. Under the Articles of Confederation, they had been mortified at the inability of the U.S. to protect itself against foreign impositions or to be taken seriously on the international stage. They had also seen that, after the Revolution, too many states had adopted constitutions with weak executives overly subordinate to the legislatures. Where this had been the case, state governments had proven incompetent and indeed tyrannical. And I think Barr is right here. And the revolution we're witnessing today by the so-called resistance and NeverTrumpers is a deconstruction of the Constitution and the Article 2 presidency writ large by federal courts implementing nationwide injunctions against things like the travel ban or building the wall using reprogrammed monies under clear grants of authority, legal authority by statute that Congress enacted and the presidents have signed into law, and congressional attempts to usurp executive authority away to unaccountable administrative state agencies. And the struggle we're seeing today is whether we're going to have a constitution at all. Above all other officers, it is the President of the United States who must explicitly swear an oath to office to uphold and protect the Constitution. And he's the one who ultimately safeguards limited government and the rule of law, which I believe cannot prevail without the separation of powers. Barr continued, quote, "From these practical experiences, the framers had come to appreciate that in order to be successful, Republican government required the capacity to act with energy, consistency, and decisiveness. They had come to agree that those attributes could best be provided by making the executive power independent of the divided councils of the legislative branch and vesting the executive power in the hands of a solitary individual regularly elected for a limited term by the nation as a whole." And again, the executive power was always meant to be separate and distinct from the legislative and judicial powers. Per Barr, quote, "Just as the great separation of powers theorists, Polybius, Montesquieu, and Locke had, the framers thought of executive power as a distinct species of power." And then he goes on to describe the executive powers that through history and experience that have been implemented under Article 2 of the Constitution since the Washington administration. This includes, quote, "carrying into effect the laws passed by the legislature, that is, applying the general rules to a particular situation, the power to handle essential sovereign functions, such as the conduct of foreign relations and the prosecution of war, which by their very nature cannot be directed by a pre-existing legal regime, but rather demand speed, secrecy, unity of purpose, and prudent judgment to meet contingent circumstances, to address exigent circumstances that demand quick action to protect the well-being of the nation, but on which the law is either silent or inadequate, such as dealing with a plague or natural disaster," and, quote, "the executive's powers of internal management that are necessary for the president to superintend and control the executive function, including the powers necessary to protect the independence of the executive branch and the confidentiality of its internal deliberations." Now, that is absolutely the Hamiltonian view of executive power. It's been in place since the very first administration under President George Washington. And it's not really a controversial view, as seen in the 2008 book by Stephen Calabrese and Christopher Yu, The Unitary Executive, Presidential Power from Washington to Bush. And this book, again, it's 558 pages, so you can see that in every single administration of every presidency, this has been the view of executive power by every single president. This book, quote, "shows that all of our nation's presidents have believed in the theory of the unitary executive, and that includes the power to direct or remove executive branch officials," which they spend a lot of time talking about. Calabrese and Yu continue, quote, "Big fights about whether the Constitution grants the president the removal power have erupted frequently, but each time the president in power has claimed that the Constitution grants the president the power to remove and direct subordinates in the executive branch, and each time the president has prevailed and Congress has backed down. The Constitution gives presidents the power to control their subordinates by vesting all of the executive power in one and only one person, the President of the United States. All subordinate non-legislative and non-judicial officials exercise executive power, and they do so only by implicit or explicit delegation from the President. They are thus all subject to the President's powers of direction and control. The truth of this observation has been acknowledged not only by our greatest presidents, but also their least distinguished brethren. We show here that all 43 presidents have consistently adhered to a practice of construing the Constitution as creating a unitary executive and giving them the removal power." Calabrese and Yu continue. Quote, the consistency of the historical record is rendered all the more striking when viewed in light of the way presidential power has ebbed and flowed over the course of our nation's history. Obviously, the country has had strong presidents such as Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and the two Roosevelts. We have had weak presidents like Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, and Warren Harding. Strikingly, these well-known fluctuations in the relative power of Congress and the president have had almost no impact on the consistency with which presidents have asserted their sole power to control the execution of laws. Indeed, history reveals that all presidents, strong and weak, have defended the unitary executive ever since 1789. And so that goes all the way back to the Washington administration, in which Alexander Hamilton was a key player. He was Washington's first U.S. Treasury Secretary and his most trusted advisor, bar none. And he helped to organize the federal bureaucracy, but not as an unaccountable administrative state. No, it was one that was answerable to the president. In the Federalist Number 70, Hamilton explicitly argued against executive by committee, and so did the framers at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. They had debates. It was the thing they debated the most, the presidency. And there were debates about having a kind of an executive council. And they said, no, we want a unitary executive. Quote, this is Hamilton, wherever two or more persons are engaged in any common enterprise or pursuit, there is always danger of difference of opinion, if it be a public trust or office in which they are clothed with equal dignity and authority. There is peculiar danger of personal emulation and even animosity from either, and especially from all these causes, the most bitter dissensions are apt to spring. Leading to what? Well, Hamilton warned, quote, whenever these happen, they lessen the respectability, weaken the authority, and distract the plans and operation of those whom they divide. If they should unfortunately assail the supreme executive magistracy of a country, consistent of a plurality of persons, they might impede or frustrate the most important measures of the government and the most critical emergencies of the state. And what is still worse, they might split the community into the most violent and irreconcilable factions, adhering differently to the different individuals who compose the magistracy. And so there you have it. What Hamilton's warning here is civil war that you saw, for example, in the Roman Republic, which had two councils, and they basically fighting out who is going to be the supreme leader of Roman Republic. And it led to the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of Caesar and then Octavian. And it basically just the end of democracy there. And the reason was because of these factions. And so they said, no, we don't want executive council members fighting it out to see who's going to be the top boss. We only want one president at a time. And this found its way unambiguously into the Washington administration with its first exercises of implicit executive powers. For example, in the 1793 Proclamation of Neutrality, when President Washington suspended a treaty with France when it went to war with Great Britain. He didn't want to get involved with the war between France and Great Britain, and didn't want to have to come to France's defense and get into another war with Great Britain. And so he said, we're suspending the treaty, and he cited Article 2 of the Constitution as having the power there. In 1793, Alexander Hamilton wrote in Pacificus I, quote, though treaties can only be made by the President and Senate, their activity may be continued or suspended by the President alone. And so that's been the law of the land ever since then. And every president has taken this implicit power to suspend treaties, including George W. Bush, who suspended the anti-ballistic missile treaty and ended it, pulled the U.S. out of it. And that's so that this has been the view of every single president. And the implied executive powers, they rely solely upon the unitary executive theory of Article 2 that every administration has adopted. Again, and Hamilton was right. And we're seeing the dangers today of having factions within the executive branch fighting out for control. We have court cases and the judicial branch trying to do nationwide injunctions and for what are clear exercises, clearly constitutional exercises of the law that Congress has granted in the travel ban case and the military construction funds going to the wall debate. These are cases that I think that the president will probably prevail in. President Trump was also given a special counsel over the firing of an executive branch official. Hey, how about that? firing of FBI Director James Comey, who had lied to President Trump about the extent of the investigation by intelligence agencies and the Justice Department into false allegations made by the DNC and Hillary Clinton campaign, hired Fusion GPS and former British spy Christopher Steele, alleging that President Trump was a bought and paid for Russian agent, that his campaign had been involved with a conspiracy with Russia to hack the DNC and to put the emails onto WikiLeaks. This was debunked by none other than Robert Mueller in his special counsel report, but not before it had resulted in foreign intelligence surveillance court-ordered surveillance by the Obama administration against the Trump campaign, the opposition party, in an election year. And then Comey went on to lie to President Trump about it, and that's why he was fired. And then after all was said and done, 3 years of investigation by the Justice Department, 2 of which were led by special counsel Robert Mueller, he found that there was no conspiracy between Trump, his campaign, and Russia to hack the DNC and to put emails onto WikiLeaks, and not the John Podesta emails. And that included Paul Manafort was not charged with anything like that. Carter Page, no. George Papadopoulos, he wasn't charged with any conspiracy with Russia. Michael Flynn wasn't charged with any conspiracy with Russia. Roger Stone himself was not charged with any conspiracy with Russia having to do with election interference activities. They just didn't find any evidence because it didn't exist. And now we have an impeachment inquiry whose central premise is on Trump's decision to withhold military assistance to Ukraine while he considered the future prospects of the U.S. relationship with that country and whether or not to request a rescission of the funding from Congress. The president, under Article 2, clearly has the power to determine if Ukraine is a reliable partner on issues of corruption, with their relations with Russia, and to determine whether or not military assistance is well advised. I mean, Ukraine's a very dangerous location, frankly, because it's a national security concern owing to the fact that the United States and Russia are fighting a proxy war there that could very much easily turn into World War III, and then humanity would be posed with an existential threat and the use of nuclear weapons. So I think we need to be careful in Ukraine. I think that's what President Trump is doing here. He wants to make certain that the military assistance is not going to be used to start a wider conflict, and I think that's why he's supporting the peace initiatives by President Vladimir Zelensky towards Russia and Russian President Vladimir Putin to help to stabilize this region and to stabilize Ukraine and to end the civil war there that's been going on since 2014, which the United States helped to start when we supported the overthrow of the duly elected President Viktor Yanukovych. We supported the administration after that. And by the way, that was to get a trade deal passed between Ukraine and the European Union. And then afterwards, Russia annexed Crimea after the coup, and then they annexed certain provinces in the east. And so you've had a civil war there. Over 10,000 Ukrainians have died, and it could easily spill into a wider conflict that will involve Europe, the United States, and Russia. And that would be a catastrophe. So I think it again, a clear exercise of presidential authority. He was considering a rescission, which is provided for under the Impoundment Control Act, and they put a temporary hold, which are not at all abnormal by OMB, while they considering making this decision. Ultimately, the funds were released in accordance with, I think, the law. And so there's really not much of a case for impeachment under those grounds. And I'll leave you with the close here. We have now seen how the administrative state reacts when a president has his own ideas about foreign policy and the removal of subordinate officers. This is the deep state showing its teeth. You fight the wars they want or else. But they are the true tyrants, these unaccountable, unelected, and unremovable bureaucrats who answer to no one if they do not answer to the president. That's the commentary. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.